over to you, Tadhg. Thank you very much. Thanks for presenting tonight.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alice. Thanks for the slot. And yeah, great to see people, great to chat. I've been to a couple of these art labs now and really enjoyed them. So I thought maybe I would just give it a go as well myself and see what happens. Yeah, so my name is Tadhg. I'm an artist, a printmaker, a researcher, based in London, though I'm Irish. And I've been based in London for about 6 or 7 years. So I'll probably just share my screen with a couple of slides, if that's okay. Alice, can you let me know when you can see this? That'd be helpful.
Yeah, that's come up for me.
Excellent. I'll just go full screen on this. Yeah, so what I thought I might do with the time that I have is present a little bit on what I've been working on kind of recently, and I suppose some of the ideas that have driven that work. And then talk a little bit about a project that I've started working on, but I haven't really unlocked or quite figured out. And I think in particular that could be a good space to maybe get a bit of feedback and see what people think as well. So as I mentioned, I'm an artist and a researcher, and my focus is almost entirely kind of around ideas of the built environment, urban spaces, cities, what it's like to be in those places, what it feels like, and what it looks like as well. So here's a picture of me in the studio when I could be in the studio, and also before I grew kind of a lockdown beard as well. So very kind of focused in all of my work around physicality. So been working in different media for a while, but I've kind of really focused in on printmaking in the past 5 or 6 years in particular. And it is that kind of tactile element of it that I think really brings me back to printmaking as maybe my main medium at the moment. So yeah, maybe a couple of projects that I've been working on that I hope illustrate to some extent where I'm coming from and maybe inform a little bit what I'm working on at the moment. So Alice kind of very kindly used an image of one of what I call my beacons, which is a print series that I've been working on and off on for the past couple of years. And this is very much focused on infrastructure and elements of the kind of urban environment that might, initially seem hidden or not obvious, and yet are integral to the spaces that we live in and how they connect people together as well. So in this kind of series of prints, I've used these junction boxes as elements that you kind of see in every neighborhood and you don't really notice them. And I've tried to use layering techniques in screen printing to make them a bit more obvious, while also kind of abstractly and metaphorically showing how they might link people together through these kind of bright colors. So an example of how I've tried to kind of make infrastructure a bit more obvious in an urban environment. I've also kind of worked in maybe slightly more abstract spaces. So this is part of a project called Tracing Texture, where I took photographs of the Barbican estate in London, very close up on the concrete surfaces. And then I tried to deconstruct those surfaces, layer up one layer at a time through screen printing methods, those images to try to recreate them, adding in some elements, taking out some other elements to perhaps warp those spaces and those photographs and those views into something a bit different. And part of what I suppose is driving this particular project is this idea of the Barbican estate as this huge accomplishment of architecture and very rich and well-paid architects creating very famous buildings, while it is very poor workers actually enacting those designs. So instead of focusing on the huge kind of forms of the Barbican estate, I've tried to focus in a little bit here on the materiality of it. And also to highlight that while it can often seem like a very bland kind of concrete facade, when you are getting into the detail there, you can see these little flecks of aggregates and different types of materials that actually make the material pop out more. So real projects around the kind of tension between architect and worker, rich and poor, designs and actual materiality, the reality of what a project can look like. And then maybe moving back into something a little bit more figurative. So I also did a series based on the shipyards in Gdansk in northern Poland, which were the site of the Solidarity trade union movement in the 1980s. So a huge, really important moment for workers' rights in Europe and beyond. And what is left in that site at the moment are these huge kind of skeletal cranes and old infrastructure and equipment from the shipyards that are still standing, even if maybe that trade unionism and that hope has perhaps dwindled. So in the series, I've tried to kind of use my photography as a layering, while also using these hand-cut stencils where you can see these abstract shapes as well introduced there, and another print there, perhaps, you know, abstracting some ideas around solidarity and trade unionism, also giving a clear kind of figurative moment as well. I've done kind of lots of other bits and pieces around terror cranes. I think they're quite an interesting, ubiquitous symbol of regeneration and change. And I've done a lot of work around that in London in particular. And then maybe finally, just speaking a little bit about a series of tapestries, as I'm calling them, that I've done. These are quite long pieces where I've tried to pick out moments within high streets, or you know, maybe have boring buildings, small businesses, nothing that you might think is particularly remarkable from a planning or an architectural or even a photography perspective. But these are the moments that actually create what a city is really, and how people feel about their neighborhoods. So by kind of placing some of these photographs together, again, through screen printing, I'm trying to create, I suppose, like a personal history or a personal memory of what a city is and how it feels to me. It's also been quite a useful way of recording businesses that are under threat. So I've done a series on laundrettes. I've done work around Tottenham High Street, which has changed massively since the building of the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. So interesting from a personal perspective, but always keeping in mind that kind of political element about who controls a city, who creates a city. And I suppose with those ideas in mind, you know, I only have a couple of words here, so I'll try and get through them pretty quickly. But I suppose two kind of axes that I'm looking at in my work, particularly at the moment. So the first focusing on infrastructure. So as this quote says, concrete, steel, copper, and the other materials of infrastructure are historical forms that emerge through and with social systems of ideology, meaning, and imagination. Whether they are being built or crumbling, infrastructure simultaneously index the achievements and limits, expectations and failures of modernity. So what does that quote mean to me? I suppose it's speaking to this idea that there are physical representations of the processes of cities that we can all see, but that we might not notice. So how can arts and printmaking be a way of drawing out that noticing a bit more? And then secondly, this quote more grounded in, I suppose, contemporary printmaking theory. So while contemporary art practice has shown considerable interest in memory as a subject, such interest often manifests as metaphorical representations of memory, of imprint and impression. So not that there's anything wrong with metaphorical representations of memory, but I suppose I'm trying to move into this space here of how can my work be evocative of memory rather than representational of memory or illustrative of memory. And I suppose that's where the kind of meditative, the iterative process of printmaking is particularly interesting for me, in that as that process is happening, I can make different decisions, I can change my mind, I can react differently to a piece based on how I'm building it. So between these two kind of ideas of what's important to notice in a city and how printmaking can be used to evoke memory of things in the future and things in the past, I guess I'm trying to ask myself if I can use physical art processes to evoke these kind of the politics of our built environments, and as I said, who owns it, who designs it, who creates it, who is the author of the city, and what is our role as citizens in that. So that takes me to a project that I've started working on, I've got a working title, which is called Housing Promise. I'm not too sure about that, but I'll come back to that. This is a photograph of Woodbury Down in North London, which was a post-war council estate built and subsequently, very recently, under redevelopment and regeneration. So in this photograph, you can see in the background these huge new build tower blocks, and here to the left, still existing social housing on the same site. And I'll come back to Woodbury Down in a moment, but perhaps I thought it might be helpful to give a very quick potted history of social housing, just for context. So started in the late 19th century, mostly the 1890s, and very much a promise of successive governments to provide affordable, comfortable homes to its citizens. And that was a very overt goal of government to take on that responsibility. And that continues into the kind of post-war period as well. Things start to shift in the kind of mid to late 1950s. So the Housing Subsidies Act of 1956 shifts this focus on social housing being available to anyone based on a more general idea of need into new social housing only being reserved for two groups. So the elderly and those displaced by slum removal. And obviously those are two groups who absolutely deserve housing. But attention here, I think, drawn out quite helpfully from this novel, or sorry, this work of fiction, fact, Municipal Dreams. When council housing is seen as housing of a last resort, it and its residents are also seen as second rate. And this is very much borne out in the kind of the history of social housing from this period, and particularly in the 1980s during the reign of Margaret Thatcher. So council housing is seen as unpopular, socially stigmatizing, incompetently managed, and oblivious to consumer preferences. This is a quote from a Conservative Party survey of the electorate in the 1980s. And you can probably see that clearly in this idea of consumer preferences, this creeping in of the idea of a market logic into what social housing is. And also the creation of right to buy, which was taken up by a lot of people and has resulted in huge reduction in the available social housing stock. A bit more contemporary then, closer to today. So we have what some people call the welfareization of social housing, where people are actually blaming these council estates social housing for things like the London riots. And you can find various quotes from Osborne, David Cameron, that point to this idea that the construction, the design of housing is to blame for people rioting, which feels to me like a very convenient way to ignore social inequality caused by austerity. We're very much in this idea of regeneration. I'm sure a lot of people across the UK and further afield can see new build housing going up. There's definitely an accepted logic that we're in a housing crisis as a country. And this idea of mixed communities being important. So instead of social housing being provided to one group, it should be provided to lots of different groups, which ostensibly I think is a really good idea. But more often than not in contemporary regeneration projects, this actually results in the removal exclusively of poor communities and profits for housing developers. So quotes again here from Municipal Dreams. Council housing is abolished in these new regeneration schemes and is only partially replaced with fewer, more expensive and less secure housing association homes. And then the secondary effect of this is that affordable homes are actually unaffordable to those who need them most. And this is massively driving the housing crisis that we're seeing today. So I suppose that comes to my kind of final words here on how this is making me, I suppose, react or feel about council housing in its current state. So very much viewing council housing as a physical representation of this sense that government should provide housing. So a physical representation of a broken promise, now increasingly replaced by new monuments to privatization and capitalism. So not only is it convenience for politicians, and I suppose I'm very focused on the Conservative Party at the moment, but I think you can definitely see factors contributing to this from the new Labour government as well. But you see the destruction of council housing. So it can be very convenient for politicians to do that for various capitalist-related goals, but also by removing the physical representation of this promise that the government can be responsible for housing, then we all forget about it. We forget that maybe we can hold our elected officials to account to actually provide this type of resource to people. And so I think that puts us now in a very kind of interesting moment where we have these huge new builds going up. Simultaneously, we still have a lot of social housing, often on the same site. And so I'm trying to think through ways in which printmaking can be a space to represent this moment of flux and change, to show this kind of liminal space where new builds are coming in, old builds are still there, although they're not being maintained. And how can print, I suppose, draw out some of those tensions? So I've attempted to do that a little bit, initially with, I'll go back to that slide, but initially with Woodbury Down. So I had that initial picture that I just showed you there, and here are two pieces that I will be working on when I get back into the studio, of two tower blocks on the Woodbury Down site. So here on the left, we have a new build. Here on the right, we have, I think it's a 1960s build called Lincoln House. So I suppose in a very obvious way, I've just tried to mirror these two tower blocks to try to highlight their similarities, but also to highlight what an occupant of this building might see when they leave. They would see this building. And so there's quite an interesting tension again, I think, of who occupies these buildings and what do they see, as well as what do they live in. So that's one piece around Woodbury Down. Another estate in North London, this is now called the This Old Quarter. And you can bet that whenever you hear the word quarter in regeneration, it's a new build. So this is an old apartment flat block social housing called Datchworth Court. Across the road is this new build, which has been purposely styled to look like this old build, but done so with kind of newer brick and shinier material and hugely inflated prices of rent. And now both of these regenerations have been very controversial because they have resulted in the displacement of poorer communities and the net reduction in social housing that's available. And that's bringing me on to this other development in London, in South London, around Vauxhall and Nine Elms, which is staggering. It's one of the biggest redevelopments of any space in Europe at the moment, as far as I'm aware. And it is nothing but tower blocks in an area that was very deprived and that was full of council housing up until very recently. So recently I've been taking photographs in the area. On the left, you can see this huge block, which will all be, private ownership of flats, many of which will be international investors, which means a likelihood of low occupancy rates. And then on the right, just a photograph I snapped within a nearby council estates, where you can see these huge buildings going up above that council estate as well. On the left, a new build here as well, and you can see within this facade, we have all this brick on the front of the building, and then none here on this other side, which is quite curious because I suppose this building is trying to tell us that it's made of brick and it's solid. But if you're not going to bother putting the fake brick on each side of it, I think it's going to be quite obvious that that is a marketing scheme rather than anything sincere. So, there's something interesting about how different angles of different buildings expose themselves to the reality of what they actually are. And then here on the right, this is a photograph again I took from within a kind of social housing estate, but looking up at one of these huge buildings. These two people, who I'm sure are lovely, but are kind of towering above this entire estate. And so what I'm trying to think through in this project is a couple of questions that I suppose I'm asking myself. So how does it feel to live in social housing when you see a new tower going up? How does it feel to live in a new development when you see council housing? And what happens to the character of a place when this regeneration or development happens? And then also kind of related to the idea of brick and material, how do the materials of these kind of spaces influence our neighborhoods? So, as I said, it's a project that I've been working on now for a little while, and I'd like to focus a bit more on, particularly around some of the photographs I've taken in Vauxhall. But I suppose I'm still struggling with this idea of representation of these spaces. You know, I can put two buildings next to each other and say, oh, you know, they're similar. But I think there's more in the print process that could evoke these tensions, and I haven't quite unlocked that yet. So I've asked, you know, put up there like a couple of questions that I wonder that maybe could be helpful for any feedback as well. So, you know, in my general approach, I'm trying to think of my work as research, and maybe some of you do, maybe you don't, maybe that doesn't matter, but I would be curious about your view on that. And then kind of speaking to my process, so how do others kind of capture the temporary or the implied or the political? And is your output important or as important as your process? Any kind of specific thoughts around housing development or infrastructure? I'm always interested. And yeah, any other ideas or tips or artists or approaches would be really helpful too. So yeah, I suppose I'll stop there, Alice. If there's time for questions, I'd love to take them. But yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. That was great. Have I ever mentioned, or have you ever come across the High-Rise project?
So is this an online database of housing estates, or am I thinking of something else?
It's I guess they would call, I've just put it in the chat, it's like a social art project. It's Louise Atkinson and I forget the other artist involved, Victoria Corticaz. So they're leading this project, and they've been doing some interesting kind of like social art research into the area. Louise works in print as well, so she would be a really great person to talk to.
That sounds ideal.
Yeah, and I don't know where, there's a publication floating around that they've done. It's somewhere in this mess of my desk, but the publication itself is really good.
Brilliant.
I'd recommend like getting in touch with her and seeing if she's got a spare copy. So off the back of that, I was thinking about, you know, engaging in some sort of like social research as well with, you know, you're looking at the architecture and the visuals. I wonder about, you know, you're talking about the perceptions of people looking at these buildings and living in them and their experience. I wonder if there's some room for capturing that kind of like narrative of, do you know, does that make sense? That kind of...
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I'm very conscious of in all of this work is that I'm a tourist, and that tourist perspective can be helpful because it can be removed in some ways, but I'm really conscious that I don't have that voice of the people who occupy these spaces in there. So with my other hat, I work at the Bartlett Built Environment faculty at UCL, and I'm starting to use contacts there to ground some of the work in these spaces and speak to some people. But I suppose the other part of this is that I'm kind of afraid of that. It's not something that I have done much of, and the last thing I want to do is kind of waste people's time. So I'm also trying to think a little bit of an exchange between maybe running little workshops or providing kind of techniques or tools of expression like this in exchange for some of those stories, or working together with people on that as well. And I suppose maybe that's partially driven by my lack of any formal art education as well. And so the imposter syndrome, I think for me, is quite keen when I get into this space of sharing with people like I'm doing now, but also then involving other people in my work. So absolutely take the point, and I think it is something I need to work on.
Yeah, I think maybe speaking to someone like Louise about her experience of engaging in those communities and the, you know, the pitfalls and perils as well, and that kind of labor of asking somebody for the purpose of art. You know, she was presenting about this project, if I remember correctly, about, you know, community artists or social artists can often like be in a community and be seen to sort of use the community for the purposes of the artwork, where she much preferred a more sort of longitudinal type of relationship where you're working in a really kind of practical hands-on way of like, what can we do with this space or this project. So yeah, she would be a great person to speak to.
That's a fantastic connection. Thank you. I'll definitely look into that.
Has anybody else got any questions or comments? Liz, do you...
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was really interested in your prints when it's so much to do with people's experience and the memory of a place, that your prints don't contain people or reference to people. Is that a deliberate decision on your part? Could you just explain a bit more about that?
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. So it has been deliberate, and that relates to, I suppose, a couple of things. My earlier work was using people as a reference point for the kind of scale and size of the buildings. And then I suppose that started feeling a bit like what Alice was articulating there, how I'm using, you know, people as a means for the art rather than, you know, properly representing them or their experiences within that as well. And I suppose the other side of it is that I've tried to be consciously, so in a lot of kind of architectural businesses or plans or photography, it's always this kind of ethereal floating perspective where it's like a photograph from up in the air that you'd never be able to get. And so in my work, I've tried to maintain that perspective of me with a camera on the ground looking up. So maybe if I go back to some of these prints. And so I've always tried to have this implied person of the viewer as the person standing on the ground looking up. And I suppose sometimes I felt like that has been distracted from having other people in that as well. That said, I've started work on a student's accommodation related project. That's kind of a branch of this one as well. And I've tried to consciously put people in that so that I have that framing of it as well. But it's an interesting reflection because, yeah, I mean, memory is grounded in people, right? It's not grounded in concrete. So it's something I could consider more. What was your reflection when you didn't see people?
Well, it felt like an architectural response as opposed to a social response, I suppose. And I was just wondering whether there would be any mileage, or you probably considered this, about imagery from inside buildings through doorways or down walkways or through windows or whatever. But obviously that takes it into another, it's saying something else, but it might be an interesting thing to think about.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think printmaking is great at, you know, kind of a collaging effect as well. So there could be ways of drawing out the facade, but also with that facade, some of those internal spaces to expose something about a building that you wouldn't see otherwise. That could be more personal or intimate or human. I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, Lynn, I can see you there. Please go ahead.
Thanks. I was just going to ask, how important is it to you that the viewer of your images, what impression they get from your work? Because it's like, to hear you talk about your work, there's a lot of content there. There's a lot. There's a lot of observation and a lot of concern, and it raises a lot of things, a lot of discussion. But if either of these images was just on a wall, I might just look at it and think, oh, that's nice, and walk past. Do you know what I mean? And it's almost losing all that power that you've got, that you've just been talking about.
Yeah, that's like, I think you've really honed in on one of the biggest struggles I've had in all of my work. And I think the most success I felt in my work personally is when I have put images alongside words. So either through kind of small magazines, through kind of photo essay types of approaches, which allow me to then give some more of that context, because obviously, exactly as you say, you're not going to look at this and think about the history of social housing. But I'm also trying to consciously, I suppose, still represent or express some of that within the work, so that I don't use kind of words as a crutch. And I suppose that's like the challenge for me, figuring out how much I can use images and prints to tell that story. And then figuring out where it's actually more appropriate for me to say things as well as to show things as well. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think maybe layering up as well would be interesting. But one image on top of another would be.
Yeah, and I think that's where print can actually drive, or at least can maybe ask the question a bit more, even if it doesn't provide all that context and those answers. So yeah, it's a real challenge for me, that one. And sometimes I'm tempted to just think, oh, I'll just print a bunch of words on top of this as well. But then I kind of resist it, because I want the power of the images to do something also. So yeah, kind of a constant tension.
I don't want it to be too obvious what it's about. Thanks.
That's a helpful reflection.
Interesting project now.
Thank you.
Frank, did you have a question there?
I just
wanted... Oh, sorry, Valerie.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to pick up on both of those comments and what Liz was saying about people. What I always find fascinating when I walk around neighborhoods and see council estate, it's how people have interacted with it. So sometimes they have paths from A to B, but it's not actually the right path, and there's a new path that kind of is created by the people as they live there, or walls. I mean, that you started with texture and how interesting that is. And I think sometimes, you see how doors get grinded onto walls, and it creates other textures and other patterns. And that's through the use of those buildings. And going back to what Lynn was saying about the layering, I think that would be quite an interesting way to kind of explore how through printmaking, how those buildings, new or old, or even imagine what those new buildings are going to become, through use. And I mean, the whole kind of graffiti art, or those little marks that you notice as you walk about, or that kind of thing. I think that's always kind of pulls your eyes, doesn't it? Or even just where there used to be vegetation and it becomes quite barren, but then it starts growing somewhere else, that kind of thing. It's just...
That's a really, really helpful point. And some of the work around infrastructure that I've done, like telephone poles or whatever, that's most obvious when it's broken. That's like really interesting thing about infrastructure, is that we notice it when it breaks down. So seeing when spaces are changed by the people who are in those spaces and tracking that as well is not something I considered, but I am definitely considering now. So thank you for that tip.
Yeah, please go ahead, Frank.
Hello. I was just thinking, you're kind of, there's a lot of things all in this area just at the minute. This is probably just me noticing them, not because East Street have who provide artist studios mostly in Leeds, and have now taken on the local plan for a part of Leeds, which is quite interesting. And the kind of, where do the artists stop? And the other activities kind of, it's almost like at some point, will you have to pick a side as they kind of destroy everything? As every time I go anywhere now, I can't find the bits that used to be there. And it's kind of you know, they don't use them. You know, the flats stay empty. The space is kind of very, very tidy, which I don't like much. Yeah, the interesting bits were people living in the spaces, not so much the buildings, and all of that. It's becoming, you know, in the town centres are now empty, so they're going to sort of move on them next. We've been doing a bit of work on what to do with town centres. There are artists sort of working in shops, trying to get a bit of a, you know, some time there to develop stuff instead of just being booted out. So you're definitely in a very, very interesting kind of area, I think. I should be very interested to see what you do next.
Thank you. Appreciate that feedback. And yes, I mean, personally, I have a side. I feel like I have chosen my side, and it's the same side that you're on. And I'm also conscious of the danger of arts washing these types of things, of creating pretty images that developers can put up in their lobbies, and you know, that makes them look great, and that they're involving you know, local artists in what they do. And you know, instead of prioritizing these new apparently impressive buildings, I think we should be trying to document and save those messy spaces. As you say, they're more important, they're more real. So very aware of that challenge, and yeah, also maybe excited and a bit trepidatious about what is coming.
Thank you. Great questions for a great presentation. So if anybody needs to go and get a comfort break at any point, obviously go ahead and do that. But we'll just go straight through all the presentations if that's okay. Also, Jenny has put a request in the chat if anybody would like to share their Instagram handle so we can all connect, which is a really good call. If anybody's on Instagram, please share in the chat so we can connect with each other. That'd be great. Oh, there's a comment from Liz. I don't know if you've seen it. Would you like to respond to that quickly?
Thanks, Liz. Let me have a quick look. Love it. Absolutely. I will look into that.
Just something you might want to look at. It's absolutely classic.
Yeah, that sums up everything. Thank you for that. And thanks, everyone. Thanks
for a great presentation. Thank you. So next we have Valerie, if you'd like to, we've got screen share on if you want to try and share directly from your video, directly from your hard drive. If not, we can attempt something else. We can see the screen, but you're on mute still.
Sorry.
There you are. We can hear you.
I lost the mute button. Okay. So I've got some slides as well, and then I'm going to show you a little film at the end, which is only 3.5 minutes. So I hope it will stream okay. So I work with fibers and textiles, and I'm based in Halifax. So I've had the pleasure of going to the art lab physically in the past, but I haven't really done a lot of the digital one lately. But so I'm just gonna, sorry, that's fine. The slide before was just where I am, and this is inside of the building. So really, I've been back into practicing, working with constructed textiles for about 6 years now. And before that, I was working in local authority and then in the textile industry. So I trained in textile design at Huddersfield Polytechnic a long time back now. And it was great because I think at the time it was, probably still is, one of the only course that really focused on the textile material and processes. So it was more kind of a science-based textile design rather than art-based course. Now, for me, it was really interesting to do that because process is really, really central to my practice, as you will see. So understanding the textile kind of technology and science around it was really useful. So in the last, more recently really, I've been trying to explore textile more as an art form rather than design, because when you work in design, your brain becomes very design focused, and I really wanted to move away from that and just explore textiles and color, mostly for my own kind of my own investigation. And I realized that the key elements is process, materials, and obviously the intention of what I do. So just to give you a very quick background in felting, I'm sure you already know quite a lot, but as you probably all already felted a jumper in your washing machine in the past by accident. So it's basically soap, water, and agitation that opens up the fibers and then interlocks the fibers. And as it interlocks, it shrinks. So that's the principle. You start with loose fibers and you end up with a sturdy fabric. I fell into felting really by accident. I can't say that it's something that I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. It was more the process, because it's a very organic process. It very much responds to what you do. And you have to be constantly trying to control it. So I like this kind of question and answer of the process. So the end result was really more something that I shaped as I went through the process. So I'm really very much, having done the textile design course, I'm actually really self-taught felter, and I've learned going online, looking at YouTube videos and that kind of stuff. So here I'm just showing really quickly some of what happens in the process. I think this is just, I work in very fine layers, so what I try to do is to slow the felting process right down so I can actually build the composition over time. But you still have to work within a limited time, because there's still a bit of felting and shrinkage that occurs. So you have a limited time to work in, and you also work wet. So you're never really too sure of the colors until it's actually dried, and you're working flat. And because you're rolling, you don't always see what's happening till you're opening it up. So there's lots of different elements that you have to keep in mind. And you can see probably the bottom right is an old mangle. It's something that I bought last year, mostly because when you're doing large pieces, it becomes very heavy to try to roll and squeeze wet wool and then reopen it up so you can do your second layers. So that's how the mangle comes in. I tend to keep the materials, I tend to work mostly with, natural materials. So wool fibers, wool tops, quite important that they are rovings, because all your fibers are already aligned. And I work with silk, or cotton, very open mesh. And I collage with fabrics using the felting process. So what happens is you can actually apply the wool fiber so finely that they will manage to migrate through your weave and trap the fabric weave, trap another wool fiber on the other side. And that in itself just traps the fabric. So you're not using wool or stitching or glue or anything like this. Sorry, you're not using glue or stitching, but just the wool felting process to trap layers together. And I also really like to work with linen and hemp and flax. And all these materials firstly respond differently to the process, but also will reflect the light differently. So it's really exploring the materials in different contexts, learning about their behavior, that I find really interesting. There was a reason, so it's about having control over it, but it's also about actually relinquishing some control to allow those materials to actually express themselves within the surface. And I listened to a talk organized by Collect Art Fair, which happened last month, I think, or end of the month before. And there was a jewelry maker, there who was presenting, and she was talking about co-creating with the materials. And I find that really interesting to kind of have your own voice, but also give enough room for the materials to have their voice. So you need to know enough about the process and the material to then stand back from it and allow it to happen. And that's really what I'm playing along all the time. Let's move on. Okay, so I'm just showing you here how very finely I use the wool. And I tend to really just use inspiration from the rural environment. So it could be photographs, sometimes it's even a stone, a piece of an object, a piece of bark, or I tend more and more just to do little sketches. And I don't need to do big sketches, because if it's got too much information, I get too focused on that instead of focusing on what's happening actually on the table and allowing those materials to evolve. So very fine layers applied gradually, and you can see how it's slowly actually building up, trapping some of the fabrics through. Now, what I find interesting in this process is that because it's quite repetitive, it's quite slow, it's quite process driven, you do end up in a kind of semi-meditative space at some point, which is where you probably a little bit more freer, because you don't think so hard, you allow the process and the materials to take place. And there's lots of those kind of senses that come into play. So you've got obviously the tactile, the touch that comes into play, you've got the visual sense, but you also have that kind of repetition, the balance, the rhythm, the temperature of the water. All of these things happen. And if you just making, like any making process, whatever, even the same if you, I guess, play music or gardening, but you're kind of in that zone where it's something else that happens with the materials. And this is what I'm really interested in, is how this kind of, I call it sensory dialogue, the little film, because it is about this dialogue between the process, the material, and yourself, how you're responding to it. So this is the final piece. So from the little sketch, that ended up about 60, just under 60 by 60. And I'm just going to take you now through examples of other work. That's the Fate of Fred. So again, lots of little sketches. And I started, it was about 2 meters by 1.5. And here I'm about 3 or 4 layers in. Hence the mango, you can imagine. So you can see where I've actually laid some fabrics, where you get this kind of C shape, C letter. I've actually inked on some fabric, and I cut it out and I kind of place it. And on the left, where you get those long ridges, I've pulled threads out of fabric, so either the warp or the weft. And I also like to just distress fabric and create other marks. And it's all really trying to build a mark making vocabulary, and I layer it and I kind of hide some and reveal some others. So it's a constantly kind of building up process. That's just, you can just guess the C letter down underneath there. And that's just a really close up of the finished piece, and that's the finished piece in itself. When I went back in the studio like summer, I needed something where I didn't have to think in the same way. So I approached, that's called sound waves. And I just wanted to look at cuts and fraying, and just using a technique called insert. So you're inserting something that's not going to felt like a foamy base or a plastic between layers, which means that when you cut through the first layer, you can remove the insert and it reveals another color. So I just did a series just focusing on that one aspect and working together that way. And that was just another big piece that's on silk only. So I'm just really looking at colors and textures again, but it was quite interesting to be able to stretch the piece over a wooden frame instead of putting it on the glass, because you're more able to really see all the textures and the colors. And you can see where the wiggly lines are, that's the linen. So the linen will start kind of wiggling with the water, as when you start with, it's actually a straight fiber. And here again, just a little sketch showing you the first starting point and then the end result, which is Take Me There. So that's about 80 by 80. You can see where there's the large kind of pieces of fabric where that kind of ochre color is, and cut and torn and then embedded in. So the other thing I did, and I've been doing this for about 3 years, where I actually gone full circle, and I've used obviously my textile experience in design, and I'm using my, so that's called the Stoll collection, and it's digitally printed on a very fine wool and cashmere blend. And you can see the top, the top image is actually the original artwork, and using Photoshop I just manipulated it to do a really large image to send out to the printers. So it's kind of nice to be able to tap into that and to also go full circle, and it gives my work a bit more mileage as well. So the little film that I want to show you, it's something that I commissioned this photographer filmmaker called Sarah Mason, who's based in Hebden Bridge, and we did a couple of one Zoom session, one phone call, and then after starting and stopping over the summer, we finally managed to get into the studio to do the filming. So that was just a photograph. She took a lot of the photograph in this presentation. And I thought it was just amazing because she asked me to think about what I really wanted to say. And I think it's really difficult to actually start talking about your work and asking people to put it into a film. So I really had to think about it. And then you get also quite tight-tongued when you've got a microphone in front of you, and you have to sound really smart and clever. It's not so easy. So she was able to edit it into this amazingly beautiful film, I think, and she really captured the elements that we spoke about. So I'm going to show you that, but I just wanted to ask you, before I put the film on, just a few things to think about. And I'd love your views on this. So for the moment, I'm using textiles, but I'm aiming to use it as an art form, really. And I know that I sit between craft and textiles, and it's a mixture of both, and I know that process is really important in it. So I'd love to know what your views are between art and craft and where they cross over or not. I'd love to know what you think about textile art and what your perception of textile art is. Because I think that as a medium, it's particularly effective to kind of pass on messages and socially engage kind of activism. And I think it's probably because it is a medium that is kind of has a lot of heritage in lots of different traditions and cultures, and it's also a kind of domestic medium. We've got it all. We know, we recognize it, we understand it, we use it, and so I'm constantly kind of thinking about this and trying to find how to maneuver through it all, really. And I think that my work doesn't really have a message. I struggle with this because I'm thinking, I don't have a message. I do have a message. My message is more of a kind of an impression and a sensory message, and it's how people respond to it. And so I'm aware of that, but I do struggle with kind of wanting to give it more validation a little bit. You know, I don't know how to express that really, but I would be curious to hear your views on that. And because I'm really also keen to try to bring textile arts or textiles back into a kind of living and working environments, more as art form rather than just useful things, because sometimes when we've got it everywhere we forget to see it. And I think there's a real connection using materials from the land, from out there, to bring it back. It does connect us with our landscape and our environment. So I'm interested in that. Right, I'm just gonna come out of this then. This is always where I struggle. Hold on. So end show. Here we go. Am I still with you? Can you hear me?
Yep, you're still here.
Okay, good. Let me connect the film. Here we go.
So at the moment on screen is still your art lab talk.
Okay, so
I wonder whether you need to stop sharing. Yeah, like stop sharing that one and then reshare.
so let's go back here. Is this me? I might find it this way. Right, there's one here. I'll try this one. Can you see that?
It's a black screen at the moment. Oh yeah, that's a film.
I love the mill because it has its own story to tell. You can see where it's been pushed and pulled and twisted. Constantly have got this changing light. My work is also very much about light. I like to kind of layer the material and the fibers to actually either mask or shade or reveal the light. And I think I've always liked the idea of suggesting something, so I tend to do more semi-abstract work. But I want to leave room for the viewer to really have his own or her own narrative. my process is very tactile. I love handling the fabric. I love playing with the colors. I find colors just change their personality depending on what other colors they're surrounded by or what textures. I love the way light reflects on certain material and how it's absorbed by the wool, for instance. Water is really an important element because it is the one that actually is the vehicle, the conduit of what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and through motion it actually impacts on the materials. It's quite a muscular process, it's quite physical, but it also has a certain rhythm to it, and it is that rhythm, that repetition, that actually seems to nudge me a little bit in this semi-meditative space. And I find that space quite freeing. It's really a space where you can operate quite intuitively. And I feel my work is effectively an expression of this sensory dialogue between me, the materials, and the process. So that's it. Check out Sarah Mason's website. I mean, she does the most fantastic photos and films. Yeah, I highly recommend her.
Thank you. That was a beautiful film and beautiful artwork as well. I loved what you said about the co-production with the materials. Yeah, that really, and it comes through in your work as well, that element. And the water, what you mentioned about the water being an important element, I think that might be something to hone in on.
Good point. One of my questions to you as well is, I'm really interested in trying to explore more what this kind of sensory connections and dialogue with material is, and I'm wondering how to tackle it. One of the ways would be possibly to start taking maybe color out of the equation and to see how it responds to materials without color, and then maybe just kind of deconstructing the whole thing and seeing where does senses, where do our senses input and do not input anymore? I don't know. It's quite interesting concept, but I'm completely blind about it. So.
I wonder, have you ever tried making the work with your eyes closed? You mentioned being
Yes,
blind,
well,
like, and really, going into that
exactly,
tactile.
yeah. There has been some research done. I think it's in Germany or the Netherlands. I've got it on my hard disk to work. But she worked with ceramicists, and she was getting them to work with a blindfold and to see how they responded to materials. So yes, that would be a good idea. Or sometimes changing the environment. So if you end up having a very dark space and you can't see so much the colors, and how do you respond the same piece, how does it look, or maybe even having a lot of noise, so you can't actually hear what's going on in the same way. So I was thinking maybe looking at it like this, one sense at a time and see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, do you have a question, Tadhg?
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks a lot, Valerie. It's obviously incredible work. Well done. Maybe, so I had kind of a question, but I think it kind of links to what you're saying there. You know, it's really striking around the kind of co-creation and the dialogue with the material. So how do you know when you're finished? You know, how do you know when that conversation ends? And maybe there's something in that question or answer in analyzing that moment for yourself of when that does feel finished, and maybe there's something in you reflecting on how you feel or what your senses are in that moment to maybe give you a hint. I'm not sure.
That's a really interesting point. You know, when you get into something and you just keep going and keep going, I've got a few bits in the studio which are just disasters because I haven't known where to stop and when to stop, and you keep trying, and it's a horrible feeling, isn't it? But I tend to, sometimes you get in the zone and you realize that you can't carry on anymore, not because it's finished, but because you're physically tired and your back is hurting and you just need to sit down and or you're just drained. You know, it's like so that's one aspect which is quite interesting, because when you walk away and you come back the next day, you always see things in a different perspective, especially it's had time to dry a little bit, so you kind of see. But usually I think there's obviously the element where I can't go any further, so I usually need to know beforehand, because if I go too far and I haven't finished and I can't go any further, that means because it's too felted and it's not going to sit on the surface anymore. So there's a physical element which is definitely too late. But usually I think it's just how it feels and look, because you've been through that whole process. You kind of know what's underneath. So you know what's underneath, you know what's happened, you know why you got there and how you got there. So that's usually, when I probably think, but I'll certainly look at that. I'll certainly make a note and try to look at why have I decided this is now complete and finished. That's a good point. Thank you.
Jenny's got a comment, and then Aruna's got a comment after. And thank you.
Yeah, no, all I was going to say was, you were saying about like being an artist or whatever. I think you definitely are. I honestly, I'm very definite about this, is that if you're creating something, if you're making something, and that speaks what you want it to speak, don't let anybody tell you that you're not. I mean, I have this all the time with some of my other photography work. People tell me I'm not a photographer. I am a photographer, you know? If you know who you are, and like I say, your work is authentic and it says what you want it to say, then you are. Don't let anybody tell you that you're not. That's all I was going to say.
Thanks, Jenny.
Hi, I just wanted to say I'm also a textile artist, and I know where you're coming from, you know, whether it's a craft or art. I mean, that's always a question, I think. I think for a long time, textile artists were considered as poor cousins of proper art, I think, or proper artists. But I think that barrier is now sort of being broken into, and a lot of places like V&A and, you know, other places as well, Tate and all that, they've had fabric artists exhibition, and I think that gives quite a bit of credence to the work of textile art. And I mean, what you're creating is absolutely artistic. I mean, there's no question about that. But yeah, I think there's this preconception still, I think, about, you know, people working with textiles. I mean, I started working as a sort of starting with watercolors and oil paints and acrylics, but in the end, I ended up working 100% with fabrics, and I absolutely enjoy doing that because of the tactile nature, as you said, you know, and it's really very therapeutic working with fabrics. That's what I found out, and now I work 100% with fabric. There's no paint at all involved, so I know where you're coming from, and all the art I do is different to what you do, the process, but it's still working with fabrics. And yeah, I think what you've done is absolutely amazing, absolutely wonderful.
Thank you, Aruna. That's great to hear. I think that with any medium, but especially textiles, they are trends, and for the moment, textiles is quite trendy, I'd say. You know, it's like galleries have started, yes, doing more exhibition and buying more around textiles, but it's like anything, it goes up and down. And I don't work with recycled materials, for instance, and so that's another side of my practice, that I need to look at sustainability, and I'm using a very traditional process, a very ancient process of felting, because of the natural property of wool, and to replace that with and it is a sustainable material, you know, and you can make sure that you have supplies that are ethical and actually help maintain the land, because if you have sheep looking after the land, I mean, wool is not worth anything these days, much of it, but the fact that you have a flock of sheep looking after the land and the moors and maintaining this, it forms part of that cycle. And that's a really interesting way of looking at sustainability as well. But yes, looking at modern materials that do what felting does is quite tricky. So, because it's just not the same structure. So you have to rethink your process, or rethink or relearn a new process, learn a new process. Thank you very much, everyone. That was great.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the awesome presentation and for the questions as well. Really fantastic. Over to you, Jenny, if you're ready.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, my name's Jenny. I'm non-binary identifying artist from Leeds, because somebody's got to be from Leeds. Yeah, and I'm based in London, and I came to the university Casey was talking about in 2014, and there's a couple of other students here tonight, which is really nice to see. And thanks so much to Zelda for coming, because she's a busy woman. But yeah, so the work that I'm showing tonight, I am a photographer. The work that I'm showing tonight is some self-portraiture work where psychoanalytic theory feeds into that. I did a BA and a master's degree on this stuff. I am a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. I'm a documentary photographer. I live in a really noisy part of London. I'm a documentary photographer and process photographer. I also do still life and a bunch of other stuff. So watching this tonight, please don't think my practice is all about me, because it's really not. And this is my least favourite thing to do, is photograph myself. So, you know. But yeah, so in my self-portraiture work, a lot of psychoanalytic theory feeds into this stuff. And it's all about the self. So the self in psychology is our identity. And we're made up of all these different parts of ourselves, like things that have come from the past, experiences that we've had, and all these different parts of us make up who we are. And the self plays a really important part in kind of our behaviour, how we behave, how we act towards other people, things that we speak, probably even the artwork that we make, of course. And it's kind of, my PowerPoint's frozen. Yeah, and it's our behaviours and our actions. And this practice that I kind of developed was about, was kind of understanding our behaviour and kind of the way that we act. And also I find it very difficult to explain how I feel about certain things, or even my relationships with other people. And it becomes this interface between my internal world, the things that are going on inside me, and what's going on in the external world. So that's what this sort of, all photography that I take is that interface, but I mean specifically the self-portrait stuff. So for an example about finding it difficult to speak, this was a 7-image series called Just Smile that I completed in 2020. And these are 2 of the images. And where I come from in Leeds, you know, there's this saying that, you know, just grin and bear it, tin hat on, just shut your mouth, get on with it, like, don't cause a problem. And in 2020, it was really politically charged year because obviously we had coronavirus, we had, well, still got coronavirus. You know, we've had a Tory government in for 10 years. Why? You know, there's all kinds of things. Brexit was another one. And I was hearing all these things, and these 7 images are all titled things that just really wound me up, and I had to kind of shut my mouth about it. And I really wish that I hadn't, and I feel guilty that I shut my mouth. For example, one could be, oh, poor Matt Hancock, he's got such a hard job to do. Somebody trying to justify Brexit being a good idea because of the vaccine thing, which just blew my mind. Another one was, and I did speak out about this and got me into a lot of trouble. One of the things, and I think it's this image here on the right, was, no, the one on the left was, somebody said to me, is Meghan Markle's dad white? And when I asked them why that mattered, they said, of course it matters because it dilutes her blackness. This is the level of stuff that this series kind of addressed, because I couldn't shut my mouth and just grin and bear it. And that's my worst thing, when people won't let me speak, when they shut me down, when they don't let me give an opinion because they disagree. But I mean, I absolutely do not tolerate, you know, racist language like that, or anything homophobic or transphobic. So as the series progresses, the mouth becomes wider and wider and wider till it just becomes this sort of scream, because it's just got to come out. There's certain things you can't shut your mouth about. And yeah, and I mean, the work kind of, almost like the textile work we've just looked at, it's kind of like this kind of like unconscious looking for a way to speak about something, to communicate something that I'm trying to say. And I mean, the unconscious mind is like right at the back of your head. It's things from the past, it's memories, things that still affect the way that we behave and the way that we act, and the choices that we make that we don't realize are there doing this. And the conscious is our thoughts and actions and the things that we are aware of. And kind of this work started as a practice of kind of trying to draw things from my unconscious mind into my conscious that I hadn't realized, to kind of become more self-aware and become a better person. I mean, I wasn't a great person when I started university in 2014. And it was only really through my teachers and the teachers that I had that I really sort of sorted my life out. And this work was a lot to do with that practice. So things like this is an example of something that I did called selective memory. They're very performative. I put the camera to just shoot, and I kind of sit there and think, and you know, I'll end up with, you know, 90 odd images, and I end up going through looking for the one that just speaks what I want it to speak, I guess. Sometimes they're about specific topics. For example, this was about someone that I really cared about, who I unfortunately don't have anything to do with anymore. His daughter was going blind, and that was very hard for him because he was a visual artist, and obviously no one wants to see their child suffer. And my eyes, I kind of felt like, you know, there's this amazing girl that I'd always heard about. Like, you know, my eyes, I put my eyes through seeing so many things they didn't need to see or probably wanted to see. And I just felt like they would be better used to someone like her. And, you know, I made this piece because it was kind of, I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't help. And I was watching this person I really cared about suffer, you know, and he really loved his daughter. So that was that. But yeah, and then stuff like this, I mean, this is an image called and I apologise if anybody here is a therapist, it was fuck psychotherapists, because I really have a bad relationship with psychotherapists. So there's some very like broad topics that I cover in this self-portrait stuff. You know, it can get a bit boring and, you know, kind of all about me. But the point is that these topics are very broad. When I exhibit this work in galleries, I don't explain what they're about. In artist talks, it's a bit different because people are here, they want to know. But in galleries, I talk about my methodology and how it works, kind of like my theory, psychoanalytic theory. Phototherapy was another practice which was started by Rosie Martin and Joe Spence. You know, there's a lot of photographers that kind of feed into this. Reenactment phototherapy was Joe Spence and Rosie Martin. They did a lot of dress up and playing in the studio. And I mean, this is an image of me as my dad when he was 9 years old, a school photograph that I have, which was important because he actually passed away when I was 9. So it was an interesting image to kind of work with. So that's where that comes from. And I mean, this is my dad as an adult, well, me as my dad, you know, rolling a fag in his Le Shark polo shirt or whatever. And that was kind of how I remembered him. So, you know, so there's a lot of kind of general stuff. I mean, we've all had somebody die. We've all had somebody abandon us. We've all had depression or, you know, known people who've gone through bad things. So really this work is not about me. And what I love about showing this stuff in galleries is that because I don't specifically write what each image is about, I get people come up to me and say, you know, oh my God, that piece speaks to me of this, or that image is me when this happened, or, you know, and people have bought prints because the images have spoken to them and about things that image has like nothing to do with, you know. I mean, there's some examples of that later on. Symbolism in my work. So Elizabethan symbolism really fed into this stuff, because when Elizabeth was having her portraits painted, she would have certain symbols painted in there that to kind of say something. And I kind of ran with this. I mean, in this, again, this is stuff I don't talk about in my artist statement in galleries. It's only in artist talks that I kind of talk about this. Because I like the audience to kind of notice little things, or, you know, I mean, it's too small on this screen, but I mean, these pills are actually shaped as, they're actually pink elephants, which, you know, nods to the same pink elephant in the room, because mental health and medical things are not talked about enough, you know. It's kind of seen as a taboo subject, or, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, again, symbolism, the death's head moth. I mean, the death's head moth has connotations. It's linked particularly with psychoanalysis because of Silence of the Lambs, where famously Clarice Starling fell for the psychotherapist Hannibal Lecter, in the book at least, not in the film. But and even the mirrored nails, they symbolise something. But I'm not going to bore everybody with the details. Again, barbed wire was a symbol. I mean, this is, I mean, I wish I'd made this a bigger edition, because this is my most selling piece, which I'm quite surprised about, really. I don't know why anybody would want to buy that. But yeah, and yeah, this is another one, chessboards, checkers, the pawn, you know, it's all kind of, you know, symbolic, and, you know, just kind of give everyone a quick overview. We'd be here for hours if I talked about all the kind of layers of theory behind this stuff. And something else that's kind of come into view, when I was just studying my MA over at what was formerly known as the Sir John Cass School of Art, where Kezia and Lacroix and Aaron are studying. When I was getting ready for my my MA, I suddenly realised that when you put these separate portraits that are about separate different things together, there's a kind of an unconscious language is produced, like a narrative. I mean, this image, which is also one of my most selling pieces for some reason, unconscious things happen all the time. I mean, this accidentally happened when I was making the PowerPoint. I don't know what it did, some sort of formatting thing or something, but there's just something about that crop that I absolutely love. I don't know what it is, why, but I love that so much more than that. But so there's obviously something in my unconscious that speaks to. I should probably make the point that I never airbrush any of my portraits, because airbrushing, I massively disagree with airbrushing and editing portraits. And as much as I would love to airbrush these, I feel like these are my authentic representations, and I feel like if I airbrush them, I would be being fake in some reason. I do, however, airbrush the selfies that I post on my personal Instagram, but that's not my artwork, so it's all good. Yeah, again, this was another thing that accidentally happened. So when I was putting the PowerPoint together, there was some sort of formatting thing, and I just screenshotted it. So this was literally like yesterday evening. I screenshotted this because I just really loved how, you know, there's this dark face with this kind of explosion of glass, and you know, this red coming down from the eyes or whatever, and there are no eyes, you know. So that's another example of kind of like accidental mistakes that kind of speak to the unconscious. So I just thought I'd put those both in. So this image, for example, I was talking about creating an unconscious narrative. This image, for example, was about somebody that I absolutely adore, a photographer, very sweet man. And he was very much like everybody. He used to work at my university, and he was like, everybody called him Uni Dad. He was everybody's dad. I remember his 70th birthday, we organised a surprise party for him, and all the birthday cards he got from students were happy birthday, Dad. So he was very much everybody's, you know, kind of father figure. Everybody loved him. And when he left, when he retired, I was just really, it really gutted me, because I thought I'd never see him again, which I have, and I am next week. We've stayed in touch, thank God. But at the time, I was really devastated. And he loved yellow flowers. There was something about yellow flowers that he really liked. And when I was curating my MA show, me and my technicians were kind of moving things around. And when these two images were placed next to each other, so this image on the left, they were taken a year apart as well. So they were taken a long time, one before the other. And the image on the left, where I'm looking up to the sky with the jewels on my face or whatever, that image was about my dad. And the image on the right was about this person. And these images were both looking up. They almost even look like they're looking to the same place, you know? And it said something about my connection with this former teacher of mine, and the connection with the fact that I lost my dad when I was 9. And it had really helped me to let go of that former teacher, and kind of, it just helped me to kind of address that kind of this unconscious thing that was going on about my dad, and abandonment and that kind of thing was suddenly just shoved into my conscious. It was like, oh my God. I can remember sitting there with my technician, Lisa, in the studio, and we both just sat there for half an hour, and bless her, she sat with me, because it was just such an emotional moment, you know, that this thing just clicked. And that was incredible. And it happened with other pieces. I mean, even this piece, these two pieces are completely unconnected. I mean, they're both about mental health, but they don't have, you know, they don't have a strong connection. And I don't know why that image is so blown out, by the way, sorry. But that was another one, these two images, you know, she's looking at the pill box on one side, and this other character, he, I guess, is also looking at the pill box. You know, you couldn't make it up how well they fit together, in my opinion. That might not be everybody's opinion, but it was, you know, just this sort of coincidence. And there was this pink and blue, like he and she. That was another bit of a moment, you know, that we were just kind of sat in the studio like, oh my God. And yeah, I had this fantastic technician, Naomi and Lisa, and they sat with me, and I was having this absolute crisis putting my MA work together. So later on, like now that I've left uni, I did go back to the original images that I made on my MA and kind of made responses to them. I don't know how well that's worked. I don't think it's worked that well. But that was something I tried to create, some sort of narratives. But yeah, I'm still on the fence about this, whether this has worked or not. I'm not sure, but we shall see. Yeah, so just before the end, I'm nearly finished. I do a lot of work about mental health because I am diagnosed with bipolar. My dad was schizophrenic, which is funny because my mum and my dad, when they were deciding whether they would have children or not, they did ask their doctor, is this something that can be hereditary? And at the time they said no, whereas now they believe that this kind of thing is hereditary, and bipolar is a branch off from schizophrenia. So, you know, we shall see. And I think it's really important because I think mental health is really stigmatized. I don't think it's dealt with correctly in workplaces. I don't think it's dealt with correctly in universities. I've seen students really struggle, and that's not necessarily their teacher's fault. It's because the teachers are not taught how to deal with this stuff, and which I think is really, like, it really affects student experience, and it's a lot of pressure for teachers. But yeah, so for example, this was an image about mental health called When the Sun Bursts, which is a fantastic book for anybody who has mental health struggles. When the Sun Bursts is an incredible book to read. So this work, the previous self-portraiture work that I've been showing you, I showed that as part of the Leiden Gallery Emerging Artist Prize in 2020. And this piece, I was actually selected, I was shortlisted for the Emergence Art Prize 2021, New Emergence Art Prize. So this piece and this piece are from a 20-image series that I've been calling, and I think this is the correct pronunciation, Tadhg, which is an Austrian German word. I'm not too sure of the pronunciation. I'll have to ask somebody. But these two images were about bipolar hallucinations. Sometimes people with bipolar, they have either visual or auditory or both hallucinations. I get both. And the more that I network with other people who have bipolar, they talk about the hallucinations they have. They can't explain it, and it's such a bizarre experience. And it freaks people out if you're with people. It freaks you out if you're by yourself. And I created a series of images. I started to document them, make quick sketches, and then try to turn them into photographs. And a lot of them are very surreal. I don't use any Photoshop. This is all practical effects, and I'm not a special effects person. So this, for example, took a long time to learn how to do. A lot of YouTube tutorials. And the more that I started to post these images in forums and get feedback from people with bipolar who were just like messaging me or like ringing me through Instagram, just like crying, saying, "Oh my God, you know, this work is like that. I get that. That's how it feels." And it was giving people this really amazing emotional outlet. Like, I've even had people message me with some of the other images and say, "Can I have like a really low res copy? You know, something watermarked or something to take to my doctor or my therapist or something like that." So I have done these watermarked prints for people, so that they can take them and use them as, I guess, an interface, which is what I started off by saying, for explaining something internal that you can. So yeah, that's what that was. And yeah, lastly, so what I've learned, and I think it's kind of good to say this because there's students on here, what I've learned is that when you're a photographer or an artist or whatever it is you want to call yourself, that one of my teachers, who doesn't teach there anymore, a guy called Spencer Rowell, used to say that everything we crop out is also a self-portrait, which I think is very applicable. Like when we're making art, when we choose when we're cropping an image or cutting something down or framing something, and we're choosing what is acceptable to put out, what is important to address what we're cropping out and why we're cropping it out. So that's something that I think people don't really think about, you know, when we're refining an image down or a piece of work, you know, why are we doing that? And this also, I think that this is, I always show this piece. I do some work with Greenwich Council with young people with substance abuse and issues and mental health issues. And I always show this piece to them because this image was about you aren't what you eat, you know. When people are judging you, labeling you, making comments about you, about your artwork, maybe they tell you you're not an artist because you do textiles, you know. If we eat that up, if we eat that up, these views and these perceptions that people have of us, you just grow so full of resentment, you know, and bad feeling and this kind of thing. And I just like, and if I had learned a lot earlier on than when I came to university in 2014, that I am not what, you know, people's perception of you is a reflection of them, and your reaction to that is an awareness of you, I often tell people. And I think if I'd learned that a lot earlier on, my life would have been a lot different. Just because all these people talk about you the way that they do, it doesn't make it true, and you don't have to eat that up. You know? So, yeah, I kind of sped through that, but yeah, that's where I'm at. And I hope people enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you. That was so powerful and
lots of
amazing. And I think what really struck me is when you talked about you like leaving room for the viewer to bring their own personal experience to it and resonating with these experiences, because as we know, mental health isn't talked about enough and causes all sorts of problems. But that kind of like that resonance people feel, it's so powerful when they see an image that speaks to them in volumes louder than words can convey. Yeah, really powerful stuff.
Well, it's like the blue one, the blue one that I said with the short hair and the earring. It's like I showed that in a gallery, and this man came up to me I'd never met before in my life, and he was really emotional, and he started telling me about how he was a transgender man and his gender reassignment surgery and how difficult it would be. And he said that image totally spoke to him about that experience. There was something about it. And I mean, that image has literally nothing to do with transgender reassignment surgery. So that's like a really good example of, you know, people resonating, I guess. Yeah.
Has anybody got any other? Have you seen the chat, by the way, Jenny? Or the comment, or the love that's coming through, and the comments? Has anybody got any questions or comments? Oh, you've got your hand up. Sorry.
No bother. Thanks, Alice, and thanks very much, Jenny. It's really, obviously, incredibly powerful work. I dropped a link in the chat there about a project that may be of interest, maybe playing with some similar themes. But I just want to ask as well about, you know, you articulated very well at the start of your talk about, you know, the difficulty of focusing on yourself. And, you know, it's something I would never be brave enough to do what you have done in your work. So that's, you know, just really impressive by itself. But could you say more about awkward feeling? Do you feel that when you're creating? Do you feel that more when you're thinking about people viewing the work? Do you feel that more when you're exhibiting the work? How does that kind of come into your process, that maybe unease about photographing yourself?
It's difficult because, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I'll get a certain idea. So take the pink one, for example, with the pink elephants thing. I kind of got a few props together, kind of knew what it was like, what was going to be dressed like, what my props were, that kind of thing. But I didn't know what was going to happen. I don't know what's going to come out of it, and it's kind of like, it's so hard to explain. It's like, it is scary. It's a scary feeling because when you embark on this kind of work, you are going to learn things about yourself you didn't want to know, and you do, and there's no unrealizing that. So there's always like a lot of trepidation, like a lot of like nerves or whatever. But I don't feel nervous exhibiting. I mean, I don't like taking photographs of myself, and I must admit the first time I ever did exhibit, I was pretty mortified that there were these A2 pictures of me on the wall, looking quite rough in some situations. I wasn't very happy about that. But I think once I got over that kind of vanity, I think putting them up on the exhibition wall, nobody knows what those images are about. That's between me and the camera and the photograph. So, and maybe a couple of trusted former teachers that I kind of discuss my work with. So yeah, I don't find it nerve-wracking to exhibit, and I very much, if people don't like my work, that's fine. If people want to call it vain, if they want to call it narcissistic, if they want to call it whatever, fair enough. I'm not bothered. That's your opinion. If people resonate with it and they want to have a chat, that's lovely. I really like that. I mean, it's a bit of a thing when somebody comes up to you in tears at a private view. But yeah, I think it's more nervousness doing the session and then looking through the images at the end, because I might realise something that I didn't want to realise or admit to myself. So yeah, it just kind of depends, really.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's that intimacy and bravery that really comes out in the work. So yeah, makes sense.
Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on where you've got a juxtaposition of two different images, which I think, did you mention it was a relatively new thing that you've done, putting the two images together?
The last one where I'd responded to one of the old sessions that I'd done.
I think sorry. What were we going to say?
I was going to say that's new. The one that I did, I had the old one that I'd done of my dad as an adult and then responded to it. So those are new. Yeah, and I wasn't too sure whether they'd worked or not.
I think they're really strong, personally. I think there's creating the dialogue between the images, especially when you're talking about how you've arrived at putting those together. The images by themselves, have that kind of that strength and that narrative, but putting them together creates the dialogue between them, which I think not just amplifies each image, it's sort of like I'm struggling to articulate it, but I think that it does amplify both images, but adds something else. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It adds like a new narrative between the images, as well as having the individual narratives, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, well, that was what was so amazing about putting my MA work together. There was all these images that had been, me and my supervisor selected the images, and then, me and the technicians were just up there putting the show together, and it was just a normal, you put all the images out and experiment with they were all going to be spaced out, equal spacing just along this wall, and we were coming up with a narrative. and then suddenly these diptychs just presented themselves. It was crazy. So yeah, it was kind of, and I even look for that now in exhibitions. I do curate exhibitions. I just co-curated an exhibition in Mayfair, and it's the same thing. I kind of look for narrative now within people's different work. So yeah, it's quite a thing.
Anybody else have any comments or questions? There's a lot in the chat. I don't know. Oh, Valerie, yes, please.
Well, it's hard to I thought it's hard to express. I think it's very powerful. It's amazing work, and it's really hard to even know how to it's left me quite speechless, I've got to say, Jenny. And it's like I'd love to revisit, to look at your work again. And I was wondering, when you do a photo and you've gone through the process of thinking it through, and sometimes you don't really know how it's gonna evolve or happen. And if you look at it again 6 months later or a year later, do you have the same, does it echo the same kind of memory, or has it moved on, or has
So it's funny, this is part of my PhD. So I'm currently looking at studying a PhD. And it's funny you should mention that, because that is part of my PhD proposal. It's about going back to look at work. I mean, because I kind of explored that in that diptych, the diptych we were just talking about, where I went back to an old image and sort of responded to it to see how things have moved on. But yeah, this is something. It's I do a lot of sculptural photography, and I have a piece called what's it called? Basically, there were tiny little darkroom prints. I think it was my BA graduation work. Oculism, it was called. A very tiny darkroom print in glass bottles. There was about 40 of them, all in liquid that was supposed to look like formaldehyde. It's a long story, crazy project. But I went back to that. Somebody saw it on my Instagram highlights and said, "Oh, can I show that in my show? I really love that." And I was like, "Okay, no worries." And when I got it out of the box and I opened it up, so no, it wasn't called oculism. It was called preservation of self. So preservation of self, and that's why the liquid was supposed to look like formaldehyde. And actually, when I took this work back out of the cupboard after 3 years or something, and I was kind of putting the bottles out in a row and thinking about, I'm going to have to put the liquid back in. What order am I going to do them in? This kind of thing. I suddenly realised that, like, the images, because it had liquid in there, and because of darkroom prints and the nature of, how fragile, darkroom photography can be. Some of these images had faded. There was one that had gone mouldy, which was really gross. And, there was these images just hadn't preserved. For a project that was called Preservation of the Self, it just hadn't preserved. It had moved on, it had changed, it had done something unexpected that I, thought I'd, put things in place that wouldn't happen. So this whole new kind of narrative presented itself to this piece of work, and I rewrote the artist statement for it, because 3 years later, the whole project about self-preservation, the whole narrative had changed. So, and that was because of a physical change. So I definitely think that going back on old work is worth it, because you have grown up and you've moved on. The diptych that I showed, which was the photograph that I did on my master's degree of my dad rolling a stick, and then the image that I put next to it of which was called Flammable Heart, and it was about what a flammable heart my dad had given me, and that was a response, because I kind of, through doing this work, I kind of learned a lot about my relationships with elder men and men in general, and how that was connected to the death of my dad, I guess. So there is, when you go back on old work, you've always kind of moved on and you think differently, or you've learned something different. So I definitely think there is something to be said for looking back at old work, if that makes sense. I'm really bad at articulating this stuff. So.
No, I'm following you completely, and I think it's really interesting that physical transformation of the actual work, as well as obviously every single one of us changing all the time as we move on, you know, so as life goes by. But yeah, I was just curious because it is quite violent in many ways. It's quite, you know, it's so powerful and strong, and I react to it just looking at it. So I know it's your work and your in kind of visualization of how you're conscious and unconscious, and it's kind of fascinating to imagine. I don't know, it's fantastic work. That's I can't really explain very well what I'm thinking either, so thank you, Jenny.
Oh, thank you so much. Can I just say though, actually, I didn't know this was Halifax based, and it's been really amazing to hear so many Northern accents. Like, you know, oh dear. No, it's really been lovely.
Oh, it's been great. I love your broad Leeds accent.
I haven't lost it. I haven't lost it.
It's been fantastic. Such 3 fantastic presentations that are so diverse and fantastic in so many different ways. Just thank you to everybody that's come and presented tonight and participated. Does anybody have any final comments or questions at all before we wrap up? It's getting late, isn't it? It's 10 o'clock. Well, just thank you so much. And I haven't scheduled the next date for the next meeting, but I don't think it's bank holiday, so it should be Monday the 7th of June. We're back, and I'll post it out there of the presenters, and please do come along. And I will put the very minimally edited versions of the presentations on the Facebook group and on YouTube as well, and circulate them. I don't really do a lot of editing. It's just literally like chopping the ends off, because I think it's just rich narrative to have the Q&A in there as it is. So yeah, thanks again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings / sleeps.
Alice, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.